Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. I've had the privilege of moving to and from Metro Detroit a few times over the years in order to pursue various educational and professional opportunities. But on more than one occasion, don't worry, it wasn't the weather that brought me back. It was a particular basketball league here that I loved being a part of that played a key role in my decision-making. It was a men's draft basketball league initiated in the early days of Come Play Detroit, which has now grown into Metro Detroit's leading extracurricular sports and social company. And for years, it was one of life's weekly highlights. With team captains and a set number of participants, each season there's a combine, an audition workout of sorts, followed by a live draft where we all live out our 13-year-old dreams, where captains pick who they want to fill their team rosters with. And even better, each game during the season has referees and stat keepers. And each week an email goes out with statistical highlights from that week's games, league leaders, and more. It's incredible fodder for trash talking with warm spirit, of course. Now, humble brag, in the early days of the league, it's the fog, it's the weather, I mentioned it, remember? Humble brag, but in the early days of the league, I was regularly a top pick. Captains were excited to build their teams around me. And in a pool of 70 players, I would be picked as high as number 3 or 4 overall. Some years later, however, I was picked in the 3rd or 4th round with regularity. Despite my skills not having diminished, although now they're completely gone. But what happened to lessen my value? And the answer is that as word of the league spread, the pool of players interested in participating increased. And the caliber of those registering for the league skyrocketed. I was the same player I had always been, but the league was now full of players much better than me. And I share this with you not because I want you to be impressed with my since diminished basketball playing abilities, but because considering who we're surrounded by when judging ourselves and others came to mind when reading this week's Torah portion, where we're introduced to the character of Noah by being told, Noach ish tzadik tamim haya b'dorotav, et ha'elohim hitalach Noach. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. So what's this business about being blameless in his generation? Why focus on his generation in particular? Well, the rabbis of the Talmud don't come to a conclusion as to whether or not the modifier in his generation is a good thing or a bad thing. As is customary, both sides of the argument are presented. Rabbi Yochanan says on the one hand that Noah was righteous in his own generation, but not in the others, while Reish Lakish argues on the other hand that if Noah was able to be righteous in his own generation where everyone was wicked, how the much more so would he have been righteous in other generations? Now, personally, whether or not Noah was righteous in his own generation or would have been righteous in others as well, I struggle with his character. Given that when God shares with him the plan to destroy human and animal kind and instructs him to build an ark, Vaya'as Noach, kechol asher tziva oto Elohim ken asa. Thus did Noah, according to all that God commanded him, he did. He simply begins building without protest. He doesn't argue with God about the decision. He doesn't go trying to warn anybody about the impending flood. And that makes me really uncomfortable. Because in our Torah, we have later injunctions like, Lo tuchal hitalim, you must not remain indifferent. And Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, don't stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. Which Rashi teaches means that it's impermissible to simply watch someone die if you have the ability to save them, and Noah had a boat. Now, it's clear that the rabbis of the Talmud also struggled with Noah's seeming indifference. In the Midrash, we find what one might call apologetics for Noah's shortcomings, as well as an explanation as to where the raw materials for this ginormous ark might have come from. Me'ah ve'esrim shana haya Noach notea arazim ve'kotzitzan. For 120 years, the Midrash teaches, Noah planted and harvested cedar trees. So for 120 years, he prepares to build the ark by planting and harvesting trees. And the Midrash goes on to teach that when others would ask him why he was doing that, inevitably walking by, seeing him constructing this monstrosity of an ark. Why are you building that ark? He would say, well, God's planning on flooding the world. Even in this kind rabbinic interpretation, Noah is still far from proactive as it relates to trying to save others. He didn't argue with God about the decision. He didn't embrace a prophetic voice to warn the people to turn from their wickedness in the hopes of God rescinding the decision. He simply prepared to build and then built. And if anyone happened to ask what he was doing and why, he would tell them. What constitutes a righteous individual? The answer, according to a simple reading of our Torah text, is one who walks with, that is, obeys God. And perhaps that's why our tradition is unlike many faith traditions, teaching that those who don't happen to be Jewish can access the world to come by following what are known as the 7 Noahide laws, named after Noah. But as Jews, we're expected to go above and beyond. Compared to who was available at the time, Noah was God's top draft pick to ensure that humans and animals survived the flood so that they could start anew. But he wasn't chosen to be the first Jewish person. When the draft pool expanded, it was Abraham whose skills stood out, warranting his selection. And I believe the reason why it was ultimately Abraham rather than Noah was due to Abraham's willingness and Noah's reluctance to argue with God. Abraham negotiates with God, striving to save the lives of complete strangers in Sodom and Gomorrah. His grandson Jacob has his name changed after physically wrestling with an angel of God, with his new name Israel, meaning one who wrestles with God. Walking with God is absolutely admirable and even righteous, but actively wrestling with God, as our ancestors did, recognizing our responsibility to stand up for and defend others, even those we have no relationship with or to, whether they happen to be Jewish or not, that is what it is to be Jewish. That is what it is to be the children of Israel. Walking with God is necessary but not sufficient. Wrestling with God is essential. So I want to encourage us all this week to be kind when we're inclined to judge ourselves and others, and to consider reframing who we perceive as being in our draft pool in any given situation. I hope that we can acknowledge there are some moments when our skills and talents can shine, when we're going to be the first round draft picks. And there are other moments where it's just as important to embrace our role as role players, allowing others to shine as well. But like any good ball player, as Jews, if we're just walking on the court, taking plays off, it's simply not enough. We must be actively engaged in the game, struggling, giving it our all to leave this world better than we found it, regardless of what round we might be drafted in. Shabbat Shalom.